Thank you for joining. My name is Carolyn Weiss, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oceans Caucus Foundation. We've been wanting to host this discussion on coastal resilience and infrastructure since the spring, so we're very excited that it has come together. So a big thank you to NCEL for partnering with us today and helping secure our panelists of state legislators. We have a robust group of members of Congress who are helping me open our discussion today. So I'm going to keep my comments short, and we're going to get right into hearing from some of our ocean and coast leaders in the U.S. Congress. So first up, we have Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici with us today. She represents a coastal district in Oregon on the West Coast and is our Oceans Caucus co-chair in the House. She's been a leader on these issues, especially in the charge to include coastal infrastructure in the current infrastructure package. So Congresswoman, please take it away. Thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much, Carolyn, and thanks to you and the foundation for organizing this event, and thanks to all the panelists who are joining us today. I really appreciate your insights and your partnership in protecting the health of our ocean and coastal communities. We know every person on the planet benefits from a healthy ocean, but for too long, the ocean has literally taken the heat for us. As co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus and Congressional Estuary Caucus, I'm committed to advancing ocean climate solutions. Earlier this year, I led a bipartisan group of colleagues in calling for a $10 billion investment for coastal restoration and resilience projects as part of the upcoming infrastructure package to build back better. And I'm grateful that the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators has joined us in this call by investing $10 billion in coastal restoration and resilience projects. We can help capture the power of the ocean in mitigating the climate crisis, make our coastal communities more resilient, and importantly, create good paying jobs in coastal communities. Healthy coastal ecosystems provide habitat for fisheries, improve biodiversity, protect shorelines from storms and sea level rise, and also improve water quality. Protected mangroves, tidal marshes, seagrasses, and kelp forests can help remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it for centuries to millennia. According to the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, the protection and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems could prevent approximately 1 gigaton of carbon dioxide from entering the atmosphere by 2050. So we must restore our coastal ecosystems and also recognize their value as an effective climate mitigation strategy. So last month, the House passed the Invest in America Act, a comprehensive climate-centric surface transportation reauthorization. The bill included important investments to improve fish passages and advance natural climate solutions. There is tremendous potential if we reframe our definition of infrastructure to consider more than roads and bridges and include meaningful investment in coastal restoration and resilience. So as you'll hear from the panelists today, coastal restoration and resilience projects can help slow the loss of nature, safeguard biodiversity, maintain healthy fisheries and wildlife populations, and prevent the collapse of natural systems that help stabilize our climate. So please know that we stand with you. We're eager to work together with you to advance these provisions as we are working on the next package in the American Jobs Plan and any infrastructure package under consideration. So thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your leadership on these issues, and I look forward to our continued work together.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congresswoman. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Well, next up, thank you. And enjoy the rest of your day. I know you're busy, so we appreciate you taking the time to join us. So next up, we have Congressman Ed Case. He represents Hawaii, which is obviously interested in the health of their coastal environment. So Congressman Case sits on the Appropriations Committee, as well as the Natural Resources Committee, or Subcommittee of Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. So Congressman, we're excited to have you here. Please go ahead.
Well, good afternoon and aloha to everybody, first of all. And yes, I am very much interested in our oceans and our coastlines. And it's great to follow my colleague and the chair of our Oceans Committee. I think the first thing I would say to you is that I take a little bit of a long-term view, which is good and bad. I was in Congress 02 to 07 obviously still from Hawaii, and at the time, the attention given to our oceans was minimal. I don't even remember whether there was an Oceans Caucus, Congresswoman. I don't think so. And that has all changed very much in the course of 15 years. That is great news, but the reason it's all changed is because the oceans are in mortal risk at this point from a number of different factors. I think we all know what they are. I don't have to spend time talking about them all. And what that translates into, at least in my mind, is a critical mass of members of Congress and people within the administration to join with you in our state and local governments throughout the country, as well as many nonprofits, to deal much more assertively, much more focused, much more on a larger scale with the whole range of issues having to do with our oceans, to include coastal resiliency. I'll give you just a couple of examples from my own perspective to go with what my colleague has already talked about. On our Appropriations Committee, for example, and on that committee, I serve on the Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee, which has jurisdiction over the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is where a lot of our oceans and coastal resiliency funding at the federal level comes from. We actually just reported out of appropriations just a few days ago a bill that's coming to the floor very, very shortly. That includes about $312 million for ocean and coastal management programs, including CZM, coastal zone management grants, and $38 million to national ocean and coastal security funds. These are small amounts based on what we need, but they're large in terms of what has been funded in prior administrations, and certainly where we're going. So we're going in the right direction from the perspective of federal funding. The other thing I would note is that in my natural resources subcommittee, and you noted that I'm on the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife subcommittee, Natural Resources Committee, Wild Subcommittee. We recently marked up just a few days ago and reported out of our committee really a major bill that you should all take a look at, and that is our Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which is really just a wide range of issues and kind of best practices, I would put, including many of the elements that my colleague spoke to in our separate bill. I think I'm on that bill as well, Congresswoman. And so that bill proposes to authorize $10 billion to a whole range of issues that have to do directly with our oceans, our coastlines, coastal resiliency. I commend that bill to you. It is definitely, I think, the way forward from an authorization perspective. We clearly have to now actually get that passed out of the U.S. House and hopefully out of the Senate. I think it is the roadmap forward, and then start to fund those kinds of initiatives. And so take a look at that particular bill. I think where I would finish though is to make this point, and that is that you're critical in all of this. In fact, many of the most advanced initiatives throughout our country, and in fact our world, are not coming from the national centralized government. They're really coming from local organizations. They're really coming from state and local governments and nonprofits working on projects that may be small in the big picture, but they add up in terms of what we need to be doing. And of course, your federal government can help to chart those courses and lay down the broader national framework and fund where and how we can. But the initiatives themselves are taking place in state legislatures across our country, and so I guess my real message to you here is and I don't think you're waiting for the federal government to tell you what to do, because you're on this call, you're involved in initiatives yourselves. But I would completely encourage that particular approach on behalf of all of you. We of course want to help, but we want to take our lead, our guidance, our direction from initiatives that may well be different between Washington and Oregon and Hawaii and Maine, and yet they add up to the kind of things that we've got to pursue. So you have willing partners here in Congress. We look forward to working with you, and time is of the essence, because we all know what's happening out there. Mahalo.
Congressman, thank you very much. And a lot of great points and things that our group can follow up on. So thank you for your time. And we appreciate your leadership on all these issues.
Thank you.
Thanks. So now next up, we have Congressman Garret Graves from Louisiana. He obviously cares about coastal ecosystem health. It's directly linked to their infamous fisheries, and whose coastline really does depend on coastal restoration for protection from erosion and storms. So Congressman Graves sits on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and Natural Resource Committee, which are both important to the topic of conversation today. So Congressman Graves is also leading a conversation on climate within the Republican Party, and we're happy to have him here with us today.
All right. Well,
So
great.
thank you,
Thanks.
Congressman.
Thanks for the opportunity to join you today. I appreciate it. You know, it's really interesting when you look at some of the statistics regarding the coast of the United States. If you take all of the coastal counties, parishes, and boroughs across the United States, they comprise only about 10% of the land area of our nation, but over 40% of the nation's population lives there. And the trends are growing, meaning that you're seeing that 40% number increase. You're having a higher percentage of the population that's moving to the coastal area that wants to be near the water. And so what it means is that as we're experiencing challenges of storm intensity increases and sea rise, it means that we've got to get good at living on the coast. This is an area where I believe the federal government does have a responsibility. There is a federal nexus. This is not one of these expanded definitions of infrastructure. This is about sustainability, economic sustainability, ecological sustainability, just the future of our communities, our livelihood. You've all seen the studies showing that you get $3 in cost savings for every $1 invested in hazard mitigation, according to the Congressional Budget Office. FEMA's done a few analysis saying it's $4 or $6. Corps of Engineers think it's $8.72. And I was sitting there listening one time to General Russell Honore, who was the Army commander who came in after Hurricane Katrina and really corralled that disparate federal response that was in place after Katrina. And he was giving the speech and he cited that Congressional Budget Office analysis and the FEMA analysis and the NISTEC analysis and the Corps of Engineer analysis and all of these different analyses. And then he said, and there's another one that says that you get $12 in cost savings for every $1 invested. And I'm taking copious notes, and I was familiar with all of those other studies, but I wasn't familiar with that one that was $12. But I'll tell you, I was confident that the number was actually higher. I go running up to the general after and said, General, I wrote all of those other studies. That one that was $12, I knew there was another one. Who did that? What study was that? And he looks around and he goes, man, I made that shit up. But I believe it. And look, I do too. I really do. And if we use the right criteria in terms of how we're making these investments in the resilience of our coastal communities, our coastal ecosystem, our coastal economies, then I'm confident we're going to hit that $12 return. And I believe this is an area of federal nexus or obligation, because you're all familiar with the extraordinary expenses that our federal government has gone through into the trillions of dollars responding to disasters, rather than spending millions or billions being proactive and improving the resiliency of these critical areas where we're seeing trends. I'm honored, you're honored to be joined today by one of my former coworkers and an outstanding guy that I have to say looks more professional right now than I think any other time I've seen him. Representative Jerome Zeringue is here, and I just want to welcome him. He is one of the folks that is really a practitioner in this area, marine biologist, ran the Sea Grant program in Terrebonne, Lafourche parishes in Louisiana, ran one of the largest civil works projects in U.S. history that had to do with the rebuilding of coastal wetlands and levees after Hurricane Katrina, and now a state representative in Louisiana. As we all know him, Z is certainly going to be a great contributor today, but I appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Thanks so much, Congressman. And I appreciate your enthusiasm for these issues too. It's refreshing And we really appreciate your leadership. And I know you've been leading on these issues even prior to your time in Congress here. So thank you very much. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Congresswoman Chellie Pingree. I saw her on here and her video's off, so I just want to give her a couple of seconds here to show her face, and if not, we'll go to a recorded video that we have. So Congresswoman Pingree, are you with us right now?
I am. I'm right here.
Ah, wonderful. Well, Congresswoman Pingree, she represents the Coastal District in Maine and sits on the Appropriations and Ag Committees. So she's been an advocate for her working waterfronts in Maine and will continue to be a leader in the coastal infrastructure conversation. So Congresswoman, thank you very much for being with us today. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this panel. And thank you to all of the state legislators who are on here. You guys are certainly on the front line. As a former state legislator myself, I know that's really where the important action happens. So I can't tell you how much we appreciate all the work that you do. And in particular, my good friend Lydia Blume, who has been so wonderful working in the Maine legislature. So thank you, Lydia. I know it's going to be a great panel. And just want to say how much I appreciate it. And I know you've also heard from a bunch of my colleagues. I heard a little bit of it, but you can see we do, we go from Hawaii to Maine, and we're Republicans and Democrats. And this is an issue that we often like to think of as a very bipartisan issue. It's just the issue of whether or not you understand what's going on in coastal communities and coastal environments. I don't have to tell anybody on this call, and I'm sure Lydia will talk about it more, that in the state of Maine, the ocean is so critically important to our economic life, our cultural life, the history of Maine. Our fishing industry is very important to us. We know that lobsters are very important to all of you and to everyone else in the country. Yet the Gulf of Maine is the temperature is rising at a rate basically faster than anywhere else in the world. So we're acutely aware of the challenges that we're facing, the migration of the species to further north. I always like to say once those lobsters get to Canada, they're not giving them back to us. So it's a challenge, but it's a challenge in a much bigger way because of the existential challenge of climate and climate change. And it's just unavoidable that we have to do something right away. I know you've already heard about really sort of the many issues that we're all dealing with here. So I thought I'd just point out a couple of bills that I have been working on, and I often am able to find bipartisan support for ocean related bills. One that I've had for a while is on working waterfronts. Our fishermen and people who work on the water, marine industries just face increasing pressure from development. And they need that, to sell their products, to bait their traps. There's just a whole variety of reasons fishermen always need access to the water, and we've lost so much of that. So this is a bill that gives grant programs to communities that want to preserve some of their working waterfront, preserve from development or other challenges. And again, I think in this era of sea level rise, we have to pay even more attention to the difficulties that are being faced by people who work on the water. I have a bill on ocean acidification in Maine. The Maine legislature has really been making a push on this. As temperature warms, the ocean absorbs so much of that CO2, and that's become a significant problem. And it manifests itself differently in different parts of the country, but particularly in the shellfish industry, we know there's a huge problem, but also in a whole variety of other ways, and it's going to continue to get worse. So that is most of that bill has already become law, and there are studies going on at NOAA, so that's important. It was mentioned that I serve on the Appropriations Committee. So this year we just finished the markup of the appropriations bills last Friday, and they'll get voted on the floor next week. But we put some increases in there to NOAA's Coastal Resiliency Fund, also into the Sea Grant program for Resilient Coast Initiative. And I think one of the reasons those are both really important is for those of us who represent coastal communities, there's an intense amount of planning that has to take place. Sea level is rising, storms are more severe. We have a lot of buildings and critical infrastructure within the shore and waterfront zone. And most communities many that I represent don't have planning funds. They don't have experts on staff. They really need support in trying to think about how to plan for the future, how to deal with the challenges that they're facing, and how to try to get ahead of some of the things that are going to be hard to stop. So I think planning money is really vital. And I know it's something that many of you guys are working on. Just lastly, I'd say I'm the subcommittee chair on interior appropriations. So a lot of the EPA grants that go to stormwater drainage, sewage infrastructure, fresh water, again, in coastal communities, a lot of that is already in danger. It's in vulnerable positions. So we greatly increases the funds for that. And also in our community funded projects, our new move back into earmarks, we funded 280 projects for those kinds of proposals, drinking water, sewage, and stormwater drainage. And it's not sexy, I know, but it's such critical funding for those communities who need it. It's a lot of money. And those projects were very popular on both sides of the aisle. So we know that a lot of members were focusing on how to get more of that money back to their districts. So I'll wrap it up there. But again, just thank you all. I appreciate so much the work that goes on in state legislatures, and we just have to have all hands on deck at this moment in time. So glad I had a chance to talk to you all, and good luck with all the work that you're doing, and let us know if there's any way we can be helpful or provide information or anything else. And see you later, Lydia. Bye-bye.
Bye, Congresswoman. Thank you very much. Again, appreciate your leadership as well, and we'll continue to reach out to you in your office. So right before we get to our panel, we have one more congressman who's going to join us, and he actually submitted a recorded remark. So we'll go ahead and play that from Congressman Derek Kilmer, who represents the Coastal District in Washington State, which is on the West Coast. He sits on the Important Appropriations Committee and has been committed to his working waterfront communities, especially during the COVID pandemic. So let's, Ashley, why don't we go ahead and play this video from Congressman Kilmer, and then we'll get into our panel.
Surrounded by water. So, hey folks, Derek Kilmer here, U.S. Representative for Washington's 6th District, which is the northwesternmost part of the continental United States. It's a place surrounded by water. So suffice to say, I'm deeply invested in the conversations that you're having. I wish I could be with you in person. So instead, I'm doing the next best thing, sending you a long and boring video. But seriously, I am grateful for the work you're doing on behalf of our coasts and coastal communities. I want to start by just sharing 2 stories from my neck of the woods to give you a sense of some of the challenges that we're facing when it comes to the effects of climate change, including sea level rise, storm events, flooding, the loss of marine and coastal habitats. The first story highlights just the size of the task at hand. 2 years ago, I was meeting with the Hoh tribe, a tribe that's known the coast of our region as their home since time immemorial. But in recent years, as the impacts of rising sea level and more severe storms and the threat of tsunami have become more acute, they've begun the process of moving to higher ground. And they've identified land to move to and even built a fire station on the site of their future home. But that day 2 years ago, their tribal chair explained to me that the station doesn't yet have water or basic utilities. And I asked, so do you have any supplies there? And I was told that the federal government had supplied one item through a surplus DoD program. The chair explained to me, they've given us 100 body bags. The second story happened just this past week. I heard from a local shellfish grower who called me and said, my family has made our livelihoods on these waters, on these coasts for generations. But that work, those opportunities have been threatened by climate change. In fact, with the recent heat wave that we saw on the West Coast, scientists estimate the death toll of seashore animals along the Salish Sea to exceed 1 billion. We had one local oyster company leader say, these once in 100-year weather events are really coming at us pretty quickly, one after another, which gets pretty exhausting. So I think now, perhaps more than ever, we have an opportunity and an obligation to act, to protect our communities. And as Congress works to advance an infrastructure package, I want to make sure that it actually prioritizes addressing the climate crisis and investing in climate-safe infrastructure so that we can truly build back better. From addressing persistent flooding and stormwater runoff to improving nearshore habitat, removing failing culverts, we have an opportunity to improve resilience and protect public safety. while also meeting our region's environmental priorities and putting folks back to work. And that's a winner. So how do we get there? First, we've got to put existing programs on steroids. Things like FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program and NOAA's Coastal Zone Management grants, both of which provide financial support to help communities construct more resilient infrastructure, but both of which are woefully underfunded. On top of that, many of our most vulnerable tribal and rural communities just don't have the capacity to compete for these extremely limited funds, let alone to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to effectively mitigate against a range of natural hazards without additional support. And so, as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I've been working to grow these existing pots of money and to direct federal agencies to prioritize applications from those underserved communities to try to level the playing field. The fact is, these communities need more coordinated and comprehensive assistance to make meaningful progress toward meeting their resilience goals. And that's why I'm working to create new federal programs that would help. In my region, the Army Corps of Engineers already plays a critical role in providing the technical expertise and capacity building that our most vulnerable communities need, but they lack both the funding and the authority to do more than provide technical assistance. So, I'm working on a bill to grow the Army Corps' role by creating a new coastal resilience design and construction program to provide direct assistance to state, local, and tribal governments to develop and implement coastal resilience projects with an emphasis on nature-based infrastructure. That could be a game changer for our communities by providing some financial resources and technical expertise. Along these same lines, I'm working on a bill that would create a new coastal restoration and salmon recovery corps at NOAA to create the necessary resources and workforce to accomplish critical on-the-ground restoration, while also supporting skills training and other work experience to help build the next generation of coastal resilience experts. Building that out could be a key to addressing these issues for generations to come. While there's still a lot of work to do on this infrastructure package, this undeniably represents our best opportunity to make some long-term investments to help communities be more resilient. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, let me just acknowledge that Congress needs to, as part of this package, not just pass an infrastructure bill, but a climate bill. We know that we're facing this existential threat, and the costs of inaction are way too high. All of these issues will get more challenging if we fail to step up. And wisely, President Biden included significant investments to meet our commitments under the Paris Climate Agreement and to meet interim goals. So Congress needs to get it passed. Listen, I want to end where I started by just saying thank you for being incredible thought leaders, for being incredible partners, for working at the state and federal level for tools that we need to keep our communities safe. Please count me as a partner, and thanks again for having me.
Okay, well, thank you, Congressman Kilmer. And so, Taylor, I'm going to throw it right to you since I've taken up 30 minutes, the first 30 minutes of this conversation. So I went a little over, but it's never a bad thing to have a lot of interest from Congress on an issue. So we're excited to have all these leaders in Congress kind of working on our behalf to get some of these things done. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and get right into the panel so we can have a time for maybe a question or two at the end.
Sounds good, yeah. Thank you. I am Taylor Goelz. I'm with the Aspen Institute here in Washington, D.C., where we have been moderating and bringing consensus solutions to environmental and energy issues for over 50 years. And so I'm really excited to be here today, in particular to talk about ocean issues and to help our panel provide the audience with some great insights and some great resources about what some of the unique coast resilience challenges are that are facing our tri-coasts in the United States, but then generally where are some of the similarities where we can learn together and work together towards a more coastally resilient future. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, but with the caveat of that in your 2-minute introduction, go over a little bit about why coastal resilience is so important in your district. Why did it matter to you to come here today to be able to represent your district and these important coastal resilience issues? So we'll start west to east. We'll start with Kaylee. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sorry, Taylor, did you say east or west?
I meant to say west to east. Kaylee, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hi all, thank you for having me here today. My name is Kaylee Galloway and I am standing in for State Representative Debra Lekanoff. We represent the 40th Legislative District here in Washington State. Over the last few years, Washington has taken a more proactive approach to addressing issues around climate change, water, and natural resource management. And Rep. Lekanoff has been at the forefront of these conversations. As the only Native American to currently serve in the entire state legislature, she has remained committed to active consultation with our sovereign tribal nations and efforts to honor and uphold our tribal treaty rights. This includes salmon and orca recovery. She has supported budget and policy decisions that aim to reduce vessel traffic and noise in the Coast Salish Sea, to prevent dangerous oil spills, to incorporate salmon recovery and habitat restoration into our local and state growth management plans, and of course to replace our dangerous culverts that have been fish passage barriers for many years. Much of our district is comprised of coastal or island communities, and so we recognize the disproportionate impacts our communities face here when it comes to climate change. Rep. Lekanoff remains committed to addressing the ramifications of climate change, including rising sea levels, ocean acidification, more frequent and intense storms, rising temperatures that threaten our very ways of life. And this means investing in modern infrastructure. And when we think of infrastructure, we think of it very broadly. This could include critical flood protection and drainage infrastructure. It could include replacing shoreline armoring that disrupts natural ecosystems and critical habitats that protect our shorelines and marine life. And it means restoring shorelines, critical habitats, and wetlands. The pandemic in many ways has highlighted the inequities across the entire spectrum, and especially when we think about environmental justice and the disproportionate health impacts to our vulnerable, rural, low-income, and BIPOC communities. With the leveraging of state, local, federal, tribal, and international funding and resources, we have the unique opportunity to collaborate across all levels of government and build back more climate resilient. Direct investment into critical infrastructure will help us create jobs and economic prosperity while also helping us achieve our climate action plans, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon sequestration, and protecting our environment and natural resources for generations to come. We must expand the way we think about infrastructure and include green and natural infrastructure. And Rep. Lekanoff is eager to work with our local, state, federal, tribal, and international partners as we work together to combat climate change and invest in much needed modern infrastructure. Thank you.
Kaylee, thank you so much for stepping in and filling your boss's shoes as much as you can. We'll go a little bit further east now, and Representative Zeringue, thank you so much for joining us in the middle of a special session and fitting us in. And so go over a little bit about why coastal resilience is so important to your district in Louisiana.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on the panel. And I appreciate Congressman Graves' kind words. And frankly, he set us on a path when he was here to get us to the point where we are, through the master plan that we've developed, through his guidance, have established a process to where eventually we hope to get to the point where we're going to be rebuilding more wetlands than what we're losing. Louisiana is unique in many respects. We have one of the only actively forming deltas in the United States in terms of a valuable ecosystem. There is no other state in terms of the 48 contiguous states that produces more in fisheries, in dollar value, and poundage. We're a working coast. We're also important to the nation's energy security and the resources that we provide. And we are linked to our coast. I represent an area, our parish, our county, is right on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And we are increasingly susceptible and vulnerable to the issues related to coastal land loss, and working hard and constitutionally dedicated state dollars to work with our federal partners on addressing the issues to create resiliency within our coast, protect one of the most valuable ecosystems in the United States, and also provide security for the nation in terms of what we provide from the energy perspective as well. And we'll continue to do that provided we can create, and we have through the master plan, the process and priorities to both restore, protect, and sustain our valuable ecosystem and our coast, but also protect the communities that are so important to provide those resources to the nation. It's important that, as I mentioned, we are a working coast, and it is critical as the coastline continues to change that we are providing the opportunity to protect the citizens and the people who provide those resources to the nation. And we have, to a great degree, established the path forward and how we're going to do it. And it's important as we continue to work with the federal government, our federal partners. And again, I applaud Congressman Graves and all the efforts he's undertaken on behalf of the state, not only here when he was here, but also on the Natural Resources Committee, to both recognize the significant contribution as the state that we're making, but also the need for the federal government to partner with how we're addressing these critical needs within our state to provide protection of those valuable resources. If you look at in terms of those resources, navigation, and all the other port systems that are critical to the nation, they reside here in Louisiana. And even within the Gulf Coast, it's not just Louisiana. If you look at Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, the significance in terms of productivity and economic impact to the nation, if those 5 states were a nation, it's estimated they would have the 7th largest GDP in the world. So within the Gulf Coast, there are things that we need to do. We're also looking at a lot of the issues with the Mississippi River and the channelization of the river, and the fact that we've affected and altered the hydrology, which is the main cause of the issue that we're addressing in terms of the loss of our coast, and the fact that we are reconnecting to the river and reestablishing the process to create that resiliency, both for the community and the ecosystem. And we'll continue to do that, and we appreciate the support of our federal partners, and we are committed to ensure that we will continue to provide what is needed in terms of protection for our communities, but also this valuable ecosystem.
Thank you, Representative, for giving us not only your parish's perspective, but Louisiana and the entire Gulf Coast. We'll switch now to Representative Lydia Blume from all the way up in Maine, who knows a lot of the working waterfront issues, fisheries issues, all of these things that we're going to continue to see throughout our session today. There is a lot of similarities in the coastal resilience issues facing our coast across the U.S. But Representative Blume, why is coastal resilience such a key piece of your work in Maine, in your district?
Well, I represent a portion of Maine that relies heavily upon tourism. We have lots of beaches, sandy beaches down here, and lots of built up environment right on the beach. The town is the town of York, and we have about 5,000 miles of coastline in Maine. Some of it sandy, some of it rocky, some of it all sorts of different, but very beautiful, as everyone knows. And my town was one of the first towns to put into their comprehensive plan sea level rise and preparing for sea level rise. And then I went up to the State House as a representative in 2014. I'm finishing up my 7th year. And I said, if we can do it in York, the rest of Maine can do it. And the good thing is that we have really grown. It was so gratifying to hear some of the other congressmen talk about the changes, how quickly the change has occurred in our constituencies, and the realization that this is important. I serve also on the Climate Council, which began with the advent of our new governor, Governor Mills, and she created this Climate Council with various stakeholders. We went after mitigation and resilience adaptation, because we know and we're seeing these changes, and we have to know how we can be resilient and adapt. But the mitigation is also a big part of it, of how do we reduce our carbon footprint. They go hand in hand in many ways. But resiliency really comes down to those local towns and those local communities. Mitigations on a larger scale, but when it comes down, we've really got to figure out how to help all of our communities that are on the coast. And it's that's been, we spent a year making this climate plan, and now we have an action plan. We call it the Maine Climate Action Plan because we have real ideas of where we need to go. And we've had a lot of success, which I'm sure we'll go into. But as I said, the resiliency and how does the federal government, the state government and local government and local communities, what is that connection? That's a really big question. I feel like in Congresswoman Chellie Pingree, for example, though, we are actually doing it because she's working on waterfront. She's working on ocean acidification, things that are very important to the state. And so there's a lot of good synergy there. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and knowing a bit more from these other states. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, because we're going to have Representative Zeringue jumping in and out with the essential votes in Louisiana, Dylan McDowell is joining us from NCEL as well to provide a national perspective, that because they work, the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators works with environmental legislatures from all over the country. They can provide a really, fill all the holes of the puzzle of the coastal United States that our three other panelists may not all be able to hit, to provide a really holistic nationwide perspective. So Dylan, why has coastal resilience been a focus for NCEL in general?
Thank you so much, Taylor. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, and I'll just point out that I grew up on the coast. I grew up on the Oregon coast in a small town of Yachats. It was 600 people, and it's the kind of town where the fisherman that owns the store that brings the fish in, and you have the fish and chips there, and you see the jobs, and people are going out fishing and the crabbing in the mornings, and so I'm very familiar with that aspect of it. But as Representative Blume was just talking about, there is this connection as we're looking at the impacts of climate change, increased storms, trying to think about what the mitigation side is alongside the resilience and how states can adapt. And at NCEL, our goal is really to help legislators connect across the country for shared learning and action, and to network with their peers across state and party lines. So we have a network of over 1,200 state legislators representing both parties, all 50 states. And we like to think of ourselves as a remote environmental staff capacity edition for legislators, for them to help learn about what's happening and what some of these best practices and creative ideas are. As it's been mentioned, I think states are taking the lead and coming up with some really incredible solutions to these topics, whether it's a bill in Florida this year to create new funding for coastal resilience programs. Washington has continued to fund its ocean acidification mitigation efforts this year, where they've been a leader. There was a bill in Maine that I know Rep. Blume played a hand in, with requiring agencies to review their laws and rules around sea level rise and incorporate that into the planning. In Virginia, there was a task force on carbon sequestration to both at the marine and the terrestrial side, and figuring out solutions. And so you can take these pieces, and there's just such a powerful opportunity to put that together, and for legislators like the ones we have here to build that into their approach. And I think it creates a vision for the future where you're protecting the communities, but you're also adapting and making sure you're taking the impacts of climate change to heart.
Exactly, and that's why I think these panels are so important, because people listening in can really gain new insights from places around the country and new resources that they might be able to apply in their own states. Because we had such great long introductions from members of Congress, I want to make sure that if people have questions as we go through this moderated question and answer period, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to weave those into the set of questions that we already have prepped for our panelists. But just so you know, you don't have to wait till the very end to get your question in. Please submit them along the way if something pops into your mind. First, kind of going off that all of you have kind of mentioned, and that Congressman Case mentioned during his remarks, that states and localities are leading the way in terms of climate resilience and mitigation legislation. So question for each of you, in the past legislative year, were there some interesting policies specifically introduced to improve coastal resilience and infrastructure within your state? Anyone can start first to kind of self-brag and talk about some of the great things that you've been able to accomplish locally.
I can begin if you'd like.
Great.
We actually have, we started a pilot project, which is called the Community Resilience Pilot Project, which is now active, and it was funded, and we're trying to figure out how best we can help all towns become more resilient. So what this pilot project is doing is taking a coastal cohort of towns and 2 inland cohort of towns, and then trying to figure out how best to help them, because many, this whole thing about these grant programs, we still need to, not everyone can write a grant. So how do we regionalize and how do we address that inequality? And so this pilot project will be telling us a lot and informing our legislation going forward. And one of the things that we are doing right now is doing foundational legislative work from that work of the Maine Climate Council, so we can be prepared, so we can prepare our people for the changes. I mean, it's forward looking, you know, we're not looking backward, we're looking forward, and it's a real different paradigm. The sea level rise bill, which we said we're going to put, we've identified and accepted the scientific analysis that sea level rise will happen in Maine, 1.5 feet by 2050, 4 feet by 2100. That is going to be put into statute. And of course, it will also be malleable because we're going to be addressing this every 4 years and looking at the data. And unfortunately, I think it's going to just speed it up. But those are some of the highlights. And of course, some other foundational work is reinvigorating our eelgrass mapping and our marsh mapping that had been defunded over the past many years. And so we've reinvigorated that. That will help us form a baseline of what our possibilities are for blue carbon, and then and protecting those resources. We've accomplished a lot. This ARPA funding, because we had that plan, the climate action plan, we were able to take that money and immediately put it to use, to plans in place. Like wastewater, we have 3 wastewater treatment plants that will be inundated by 2050. So we have now millions of dollars in a fund to help upgrade wastewater treatment plants and be prepared. So, you know, this has been a very exciting time in Maine. We got everybody on the same page. We're really making progress since I began in 2014. It's just a really big leaps, and I'm just ready to celebrate. We just finished last night, and we have things to celebrate, and we have to celebrate our accomplishments, and we have to have hope for the future, because it's very important. As you said, 40% of the population live there and live on the coast. And I love how everyone who's talking about resilience is talking about it in terms of nature-based solutions. We've got to make that our priority, because it's going to be so easy to just say, let's just put up seawalls for everybody, and that just won't work. So anyway, that's just some of the highlights of what we have done in Maine. Very proud of it, very excited for the future, moving forward.
That's fantastic. Thanks for giving us that great overview. And Representative Zeringue, you were going to jump in.
Yes, please. Thank you. And from our perspective, 2/3 of our population live within what's considered the coastal area. And proud to say, and I know Congressman Graves was a critical component of developing the state's master plan, where we have a $50 billion plan that establishes priorities for restoring and protecting our coast, and also creating resiliency for our coastal communities. And this is a plan that is established to where science determines what are the priorities in terms of where are the best projects, or how we're getting the best bang for the buck for the limited dollars that are there, but also protecting the communities. And all of it is factored, or the factors associated with the implementation of the state's master plan factors in sea level rise and the risks associated with living in and along the coast. But also it's to protect the environment, but also protect coastal communities. And the decisions that are made within the coastal Louisiana, factor all of those available issues, and the master plan itself helps direct how coastal communities can become more resilient and build stronger and smarter, and what we're doing to protect this valuable ecosystem. And science is leading the way. We have stakeholder involvement groups. We have within the master plan, it's a $50 billion plan over 50 years, but we're working to reduce the years and trying to increase funding as best we can. But we have annual plans to ensure that we're using the latest in terms of technology, public involvement and engagement. We have stakeholder groups that meet and would be not only for the annual plan themselves, but the development of the master plan that is reviewed every 6 years. So we reestablish and look at the master plan from the beginning to ensure that we're utilizing the latest in information technology. Louisiana, for the most part, is the canary in the coast mine for the United States. A lot of the issues we're facing because of the loss of our coast, it's obvious in other areas in Florida, the East Coast, the fact that storms are impacting us more to a greater degree. The unfortunate reality in Louisiana, when a named storm enters the Gulf of Mexico, the highest probability of making landfall is along the coast of Louisiana. So we've been living this for a long time, and we're working on trying to create that resiliency as we continue to protect this valuable ecosystem as well. And we have a plan to do it, and we're doing it with science leading the way.
That's what I think has really been a highlight that both of you have talked about, is science leading the way, and the adaptivity of these plans is that they're not being set in stone, that you're continuing to revisit them, continuing to bring new science, new insights, new stakeholder voices into it. Kaylee, can you talk a little bit about that from Washington's perspective?
Well, and I was just going to make note of one of the bills that the Washington legislature this past 5273 was the bill number, and it concerned replacing shoreline armoring. So, as assessments show, about 29% of our Puget Sound shoreline have bulkheads, seawalls, or other hard armoring systems that disrupt natural shorelines. And we see that that also reduces and harms critical habitat for salmon. So this bill in particular would require people replacing that shoreline infrastructure to consider the impacts to ecosystem and alternative options that might better promote the health of our shoreline. So that was one very specific bill the Washington legislature took up this year. And Taylor, I know you kind of had a second question there. Could you rephrase it for me?
It was just kind of building off of what some of that Representative Blume and Zeringue talked a little bit broadly about what they've done over the past year, but then how their state and how Washington as well is adaptively moving forward. And so not using a line in the sand necessarily that's put in concrete, but that's maybe in sand, that you can then adjust as science comes in, as new voices come in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely think Washington State is considering these alternative options, just recognizing such a huge portion of our state is along the coast. And so I know we've had some broader climate related policies as well, which I'm happy to kind of further discuss as we go along. But perhaps I will yield back the time.
Spoken like a chief of staff, I love it. So one thing that some of the earlier remarks have brought up and that you've each touched on is all the different voices that come to the table when you're doing any sort of coast resilience planning, and thinking about equity, and not just in terms of whose voices are being heard, but who's being funded, where the money's going, staff power in order to apply for grants, like the ability to have someone be able to write full time to do this, matching funds in localities. What are some of these, some of the biggest issues that you see going forward in those terms for your communities in dealing with some of these coastal resilience issues? Go ahead, Representative Zeringue. Yeah.
Yes. From our perspective, the system that was established identifies the diversity that we have along our coast. I mentioned earlier we're a working coast. I mean, we have a coast where we have oil and gas infrastructure, but also fisheries next door to each other. We have navigation interests. 5 of the largest ports in the United States are within Louisiana. So there is no doubt that there is a working coast within this ecosystem, it's an environment, and people recognize that we're tied to this, and the resources are contingent upon and necessary to provide protection to the resource as well. So we did a good job early on to involve as best we can the stakeholders and the diverse user groups from the natural ecosystem perspective, but also from the working group perspective, from industry, from seafood. We have oysters, shrimp, crabs, all the other aspects just within fisheries that are important, but also how that affects the development of the plan, the implementation of the plan, and making sure that we are aware of that. Just because it fits one particular aspect or benefits one, we want to look at the impacts or the unintended consequences that may occur by implementing this. So working to ensure that we protect the estuary and what's important to the valuable fisheries ecosystem, but also recognizing that we do have a significant navigation interest and interest within the Mississippi River and how that is important to the people in the Midwest and to throughout the United States. The fact that the ports in Louisiana provide that critical infrastructure that is needed. So we have built within the master plan process, as I referenced earlier, in terms of the prioritization of the projects, a process as best we can to incorporate and evaluate the various stakeholders and user groups and allow them to contribute and provide input to that as we move forward in the prioritization and implementation of the projects. And again, we update that every 6 years on the master plan, but we also have annual plans that we go through for that particular year, the implementation of those particular projects, and allow people to have input and access to that.
That's great. Representative Blume, yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of equity, I guess that's what we're talking about, right? How does the Climate Council began with equity as part of its guiding principle, and we also have an equity subcommittee on the Climate Council that's looking at all of these things. And part of that pilot project that I mentioned earlier is to see how maybe regionalization can help all different communities write grants. I particularly would like to just ask the question, is there an alternative to grants as a form of sending money to towns for this type of work? Is there something, do we need to be able to respond to the system in place now, or do we create a new system that could still be equitable and disperse the money efficiently? I don't know. The other thing about equity is the National Flood Insurance Program. And I'm trying to relate this to some of the federal stuff too, because I think that's important, that the National Federal Insurance focuses a lot more on urban areas. And so the rural communities don't have that kind of resource. So and also they're not forward looking when it comes to the insurance.
Yeah.
So I would like to see some pointed and conversation about the National Flood Insurance Program and how that's, how does insurance play a role in all of this as well? So those are some of the kind of questions that I think we need to address. But we're trying hard in Maine to, as I said, to try to work within the system that's given to us with the grant writing and provide those resources to those towns that just don't have it. Maine has a very strong home rule state, so these towns have a lot of power, but they don't have a lot of money. So and many of them don't. So we're trying to figure out, again, resiliency and adaptation is really a local issue. How do you get other people? How do you get other successful implementation programs? How do you communicate that to other towns? That's the kind of thing that we're trying to work on as well here.
Kaylee?
Yeah, and I just may add a couple things. So first of all, here in Washington State, we're home to 29 federally recognized tribes, many of whom live on the traditional homelands and along the coast. And so we do see an inevitable disproportionate impact to our tribal communities when we think about coastal resiliency and the potential ramifications of climate change. So with Representative Lekanoff being the only Native American to serve in the state legislature, she really has worked quite hard across the Washington State House and the Senate and all the different state agencies to be that proactive and active partner from a government to government engagement and consultation process around being co-managers of our state's natural resources and our salmon. So I think about tribal sovereignty when I think quite about engagement around coastal resiliency issues. And really, we should be consulting our tribes in every state and across the nation. And sovereignty being very distinct and different from equity, right? And I know Washington State is also very much working towards increasing and weaving equity throughout all of our budget and policy decisions. Last year, we passed a bill that created the Office of Equity underneath our governor's office. And this year we passed the HEAL Act, the Healthy Environment for All, which would implement the recommendations from the governor's Environmental Justice Task Force. And it also tasks some of our main state agencies to conduct an environmental justice assessment and to specifically engage communities who've been disproportionately impacted by climate change. So I would say those are sort of the two big sort of the sovereignty and the equity being two huge components in our engagement on these issues.
I think those really represented, I couldn't have planned it better, you know, the diversity of what equity can mean in terms of coastal resilience, in terms of getting stakeholders to the table, thinking through different issues together, but making sure that science leads the way. And I think that's been an overarching thing in all of our conversations, which is a fantastic kind of place to conclude, which it feels like we just got started, but we're at the top of the hour because we had such a great contribution from the very beginning. So thank you so much for your ability to get so deep so quickly and be able to really give us a great idea of what coastal resilience looks like in your localities, in your states, why it matters to your stakeholders. And I think that the audience can really tell your dedication to who you're serving in your districts. And so we thank you so much for being with us here today and providing some input. I'll throw it back to you, Carolyn, if you want to conclude it out. And if not, you can see, if everyone can see that Carolyn's email is in the chat. If you have any additional questions, she can help do some of the directing if people wanted to talk to some of our panelists again or have more direct questions after this. Carolyn?
Thanks, Taylor, and panelists, state legislators, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this conversation continues. Please do reach out. My email's in the chat, and we'll continue to connect people, whether it's with the state legislators or the members of Congress and offices or any of our other ocean stakeholders. This is an important topic and it's timely. So looking forward to working with everyone, and thanks again for participating.